January 1942. Somewhere over occupied Europe. The night sky hums with engines. Low and distant at first, then growing louder, heavier, until the darkness itself ceases to vibrate. Below, a pale grid of lights forms on the ground. Straight lines. Perfect angles. Runways glowing faintly through the fog. An airfield. Bomb bay doors open in the freezing wind. The aircraft shudders as the first payload slips free and disappears into the blackness below. Seconds later, more follow. A steady rhythm. A practiced act. The deadly routine of war. Explosions ripple across the field. But something is wrong. There is no secondary blast from fuel tanks. No scrambling vehicles. No frantic anti-aircraft fire rising to meet the bombers. Only silence and burning shapes that do not burn the way aircraft should. By dawn, German ground crews stand frozen in disbelief. The hangars were made of timber. The aircraft nothing but wood and canvas. The runways painted earth. And scattered among the wreckage lie strange objects, pale against the dark soil. Not metal. Not steel. Not unexploded ordnance. Wooden bombs. Carved. Smoothed. Deliberate. A message without words. A warning from unseen enemies that in this war, even the battlefield itself may be a lie. And behind that lie waits a story far stranger than anything dropped from the sky. When the Second World War began in September 1939, few commanders fully grasped how quickly the battlefield would rise into the air. Within months, war was no longer fought only by infantry and artillery, but by engines and altitude. Entire campaigns would be decided not by who controlled the roads, but who ruled the sky above them. Aircraft were no longer reconnaissance tools or support platforms, they were weapons in themselves. And like any weapon, they were vulnerable when resting, refueling, and repairing on the ground. By the time Germany launched its lightning assault across Western Europe in May 1940, airfields had become some of the most valuable real estate in existence. Runways were lifelines. Hangars were arsenals. Fuel dumps were arteries pumping war into the wings of aircraft. Knock out an airbase, and you did not simply destroy aircraft, you strangled a nation's ability to fight in the air. During the fall of France and the opening phases of the Battle of Britain, Luftwaffe bombers targeted British airfields relentlessly. The goal was not outright destruction of cities, not yet, but surgical elimination of Britain's air power at its source. The logic was brutally simple. You could dodge fighters, outfly flak, and survive dogfights. But if your aircraft were caught on the ground, they were helpless. Wings full of fuel. Bomb bays still open. Engines still cooling. One well-placed bomb could obliterate multiple planes at once. During the French campaign alone, German air attacks destroyed hundreds of Allied aircraft while they sat neatly lined along runways, their pilots helpless miles away. Air superiority was not just won in the sky, it was harvested on the ground. Britain learned this lesson almost immediately and painfully. In the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged overhead, German bombers pounded RAF fighter command bases with ruthless efficiency. Chains of airfields across southern England came under near-daily assault. Operations rooms were buried. Control towers collapsed under fire. Runways cratered into broken mosaics of concrete and dust. Crews worked through the night repairing damage with shovels and floodlights, knowing the bombers would likely return before the sun rose again. But striking back at the German bomber force alone would not be enough. Britain faced a terrifying reality. The Luftwaffe had the numbers and the initiative, and Britain could not afford to lose its airfields. They needed another weapon, something quieter than a Spitfire, something invisible to radar, something that would not fire bullets but would bend belief. The answer was deception. By late 1940, British planners began to turn away from reactive defence and towards psychological warfare. If Germany was hunting airfields, Britain would give them airfields to hunt. But not real ones. Fields, forests, coastlines, and barren farmland began to transform into stages of illusion. Wooden hangars rose where no aircraft had ever landed. Canvas planes were rolled into formation at sunset, aligned precisely to resemble operational squadrons from the air. Fake runways were brushed into dirt with lime and crushed stone, glowing convincingly beneath moonlight. Fuel tanks were painted empty on purpose. Lights were wired into grids that appeared to pulse like living air bases. These places were not bases at all. They were bait. In Britain, they were known as decoy airfields, and soon an entire branch of wartime engineering focused solely on lies. Some were crude little more than outlines and shadows, while others were near-perfect replicas of operational RAF stations. The goal was not to fool infantry. It was to deceive men flying at several thousand feet, navigating by memory, maps and fleeting glimpses through cloud and smoke. And it worked. German bombers diverted their attacks. Loads meant for real airfields tore apart piles of timber and canvas instead. Explosions blossomed across farmland instead of concrete. Fires burned in empty fields while real aircraft sat unharmed miles away. But Britain was not alone in discovering this tool. Across occupied Europe and within Germany itself, the Luftwaffe was building its own illusions. They called them attrappen dummies. Entire sham airfields appeared almost overnight across France, the Netherlands, and German training grounds. Wooden aircraft were placed in neat rows. Fake hangars were carefully aligned. Dummy fuel trucks stood permanently frozen beside roads that led nowhere. To Allied aerial reconnaissance pilots, the skies became a chessboard of uncertain realities. Was that a fighter base? Or a painting? Was that a runway? Or whitewashed dirt? Was that a squadron? Or a trap? The air war was no longer just a test of speed and firepower. It was now a war of eyesight. A war of interpretation. A war of doubt. Because if you bombed the wrong airfield, whether real or fake, someone, somewhere, would pay in blood for the mistake. And as deception evolved from trick to doctrine, wooden runways and canvas squadrons multiplied across Europe like ghost installations. The ground became theatre. And the air above it, an audience forced to guess which parts were real. It was within this strange new battlefield where entire military bases could be illusions that one of the war's most curious stories would be born. A story not just about fake airfields, but about retaliation so symbolic it would blur into legend. A story of wood used to fight steel, and steel made to doubt itself. Dummy drones and attrappen, building fake airfields. By the time the war entered its most brutal aerial phases, deception was no longer an experiment. It was policy. Governments committed not just engineers, but artists, electricians, carpenters, and illusionists to the front lines. The modern battlefield needed architects of fiction as much as it needed pilots. Because if an enemy could be persuaded to aim at nothing, then everything real was instantly safer. In Britain, decoy airfields were assembled with methodical care. Entire countryside flats were requisitioned not to launch aircraft, but to impersonate them. Runway outlines were brushed into chalk soil. Fires were staged after air raids to simulate burning wreckage. Lighting rigs were built to mimic operations rooms and hangar shadows. Even simulated vehicle tracks were stamped into the mud so that reconnaissance photos would show activity where none existed. And when German bombers dropped their loads, these empty fields exploded into flames, while RAF bases just miles away remained untouched. Some decoys were elaborate down to the smallest detail. Pilots flying low enough could see Spitfires parked neatly beside what looked like hangars, their wings glinting under moonlight. Only on the ground would the secret be obvious: their fuselages were hollow frames of wood and wire, stretched with painted fabric. Entire aircraft squadrons that could not fly, but could die convincingly. The Germans, too, turned illusion into industry. Across occupied territories and within the Reich, fake airfields multiplied. Luftwaffe training schools were surrounded by dummy dispersal areas. Fighter bases were mirrored by decoy counterparts several miles away, carefully placed to draw bombs away from real operations. The Luftwaffe, like the RAF, understood that the cheapest aircraft to lose was the one that never existed. German engineers crafted wooden Messerschmitts and bombers from skeletal frames and canvas skins. Black crosses were painted onto wings for authenticity. Grass was rolled flat to match the tire tracks of imaginary landings. Hangars were built with false doors and roofs strong enough to look real, but meant to collapse dramatically when hit. The illusion did not need to last long, only long enough to deceive a man looking down through cloud and smoke. Aerial reconnaissance had already become a deadly science by 1941. Allied pilots risked their lives flying deep over enemy territory, photographing installations, recording taxiways, counting aircraft with magnifying glasses upon their return. Analysts in windowless rooms studied thousands of images, searching for patterns, for contradictions, for evidence of truth inside the lie. And the Germans fought back with artistry. Aircraft were moved in circular patterns at sunset so that dust clouds would suggest activity. Paint was weathered artificially so nothing looked too new in reconnaissance photos. Fences were bent. Tracks were dirtied. Everything that could not happen naturally was manufactured. The battlefield no longer ended at barbed wire. By then, it also lived inside the mind. And in this maze of appearances, a curious purpose emerged. These false airfields were not merely protective. They were provocations. They invited bombs. They dared the enemy to waste their payload. And somewhere inside this escalating duel of trickery came a moment so bizarre it could only exist in this type of war. A report quietly passed after the war. Then another. Years later, another still. One version placed it in Holland, another in northern France, a third near Berlin itself. But they all spoke of the same strange retaliation. A decoy field, perfectly constructed, meticulously maintained. And then an Allied aircraft flew over it and dropped something that did not explode. When German personnel approached in daylight, they found not craters, but carvings. Bombs made entirely of wood, smooth, weighted, precision cut, and marked with a phrase that read not like a military order, but like a sly whisper in the dark. Wood for wood. No official records confirmed the incident. No photographs surfaced. No after-action reports archived it. And yet, the story refused to die. It appeared in officer memoirs, in post-war storytelling, in obscure military publications, in researcher correspondence. One former Luftwaffe officer, Werner Thiel, later claimed to have seen them himself, wooden bombs scattered across a dummy training airfield near Borkade, south of Berlin. A training school that used fake aircraft. A sight the Allies would have known was false. And if his memory was accurate, then something extraordinary had happened. Not an act of destruction, but a statement. A realization had passed from one side of the war to the other, not through radio or telegram, but through wood. The enemy was no longer fooled. And that knowledge itself, quietly delivered, might have been the real bomb. In a war where entire cities vanished in fire, it was illusion that carried the sharpest message of all. The war in the air was not only fought by men who pulled triggers and throttles. It was also fought by men who stared at photographs. Thousands of them. Every day. In darkened rooms, under lens lamps, across light tables. Their job was to decide what was real and what was a lie. A single mistake could send a bomber wing against empty farmland, or worse, away from a real target that would live to kill tomorrow. Allied reconnaissance pilots flew into some of the most dangerous skies on Earth. Their aircraft were lighter, faster, unarmed or lightly defended. Their mission was not to fight but to see. Cameras hung beneath wings like spare hearts. And as anti-aircraft fire reached for them, they photographed everything: roads, rivers, forests, rooftops, and airfields. An airfield was never just a runway. It was a pattern, a signature. Analysts searched for it like detectives follow footprints. Where did shadows fall? How did the ground break around hangars? Were aircraft parked at operational distances or laid out like pieces on a game board? Where was the oil staining? The churned earth? The signs of human chaos that only real activity created? Decoys were unnervingly good. Some were better than real installations. In Britain, aerial analysts learned that fake airfields often betrayed themselves by being too clean. Real bases were muddy, worn, messy. Decoys were often too symmetrical. Aircraft too evenly spaced. Tracks too perfect. In France, Allied photo interpreters began to recognize standard templates German decoy engineers used. Once seen enough times, the illusion lost its power, but only for those who knew what to look for. The men in the cockpits often didn't. Pilots approached targets knowing they might be wasting bombs on nothing at all. A black shape on farmland could be a Heinkel squadron or cardboard skeletons. The choice to drop was sometimes based on gut instinct. And when the wrong decision was made, the only sound afterward was silence. Because bombers do not receive confirmation. They only leave. And somewhere in that silence, belief took root. Angle 2. The engineer's blueprint how to build a fake airfield from wood. A decoy airfield was not created by accident. It was drafted. The British Ministry of Home Security and later specialised deception units wrote manuals explaining how to make bases from nothing. Each false airfield followed real-world logic, measured down to dispersal distances and runway angles. Engineers did not ask how cheaply they could build something. They asked how exactly it could imitate. Wood was not chosen because it was weak. It was chosen because it obeyed the eye. Canvas became aluminum in moonlight. Timber became reinforced concrete in haze. In German territory, the Luftwaffe did the same, only larger. German dummy installations were so common that Allied pilots took reconnaissance photos of fake targets almost as often as real ones. German attrap teams moved entire wooden squadrons at night, altering positions to simulate daily use. They rolled fuel drums to create stains, set lamps in windows to imply night crews. Some fake aircraft could even be rotated using simple rails. From above, it looked like activity. And activity meant reality. The irony deepened the further the war went on. Men risked their lives building targets designed to be destroyed. Whole crews laboured for days just to fool a man they would never meet. It was not about strength anymore. It was about credibility. A believable lie was more valuable than 1,000 guns. Angle 3. The pilot's cockpit decision at altitude in the bomber cockpit. Truth came only in pieces. Pilots were briefed before missions, maps marked with circles and code names. Intelligence officers warned of decoys. But in the air, a man had seconds, not documents. Flying low over hostile ground at night meant trusting eyes that lied. A shape looked sharp. A line looked straight. A glow looked warm. Was it flame? Or lamp? Were those aircraft? Or shadows? Control panels glowed pale green in the cockpit, reflecting off frozen glass. Ground fire lit clouds from below, like distant lightning. And beneath it all lay the target or something pretending to be one. Some pilots knew when they were bombing nothing. Others didn't. Stories began to circulate. One crew swore they hit a field where planes burned wrong. Another swore bombs fell and nothing replied. And then came whispers. Of crews who dropped scrap metal. Of others who dropped notes. Not missiles. Not fire. Messages. When the idea of wooden bombs began to move through aircrew circles, it was treated not as fact, but as folklore. Airmen's language became darkly comic. If the enemy was building wooden planes, then maybe someone should fight wood with wood. Whether as joke, or warning, or truth, something had shifted. And where wood had once been imitation, it was becoming an answer. An answer the enemy would find standing alone in daylight. The Second World War is remembered for its brutality, for mass destruction measured in cities and millions. But beneath the numbers, soldiers fought another, quieter war, one waged with nerves, uncertainty, and wit. Humor, in strange ways, became armor. And sometimes it became a weapon. Mockery has always been part of warfare. Long before propaganda leaflets fell from Bombays, armies had written taunts on artillery shells and carved insults into rifle stocks. But by the 1940s, psychological warfare had matured into something systematic. Entire departments were dedicated to breaking morale before bodies. Radio broadcasts imitated enemy stations. Fake orders were dropped behind lines. False troop movements were transmitted in code, hoping someone on the other side was listening. If wooden bombs were ever dropped deliberately, they would fit perfectly within this doctrine, not as destruction, but communication. In this interpretation, the wooden bomb is not a joke. It is a message written in shape and silence. It says, "We see your lies." It says, "We are not fooled." It says, "Your illusion costs you more to build than it costs us to ignore." Dropped without explosives, the wooden bomb humiliates instead of kills. It transforms a careful deception site into theatre. The builders become the audience. The joke is not for the German public, it is for those working inside the lie itself. A psychological strike aimed not at cities, but at confidence. In the rumor version of the story, the bombs even carried words, "Wood for wood." If that message existed even once, it would represent a rare moment in which war paused just long enough for sarcasm. This was not the only illusion used to shatter belief. In Britain, de Havilland's mosquito factory had been destroyed by German air raids in 1941, at least according to Berlin radio. The British welcomed the report. The factory continued working at full capacity behind a fake shell of ruins. The illusion held. Bombers did not return. Victory through invisibility. The wooden bomb story belongs to that category, the kind of warfare that never appears in battle maps, but changes them quietly all the same. Angle 5. The German perspective: fear, work and wooden aircraft for German ground personnel stationed at fake airfields and training facilities. War was not glamorous. They were not aces. They were not celebrated. They were carpenters in uniform. At places like Borcade, Luftwaffe trainees worked among wooden aircraft every day. They learned formations from objects that could never lift. They practiced maintenance on shapes that represented machines. They guarded installations built from falsehood. The danger, however, was always real. Just because an airfield was fake did not mean bombs weren't real. Many decoy sites drew fire as intended, and that meant death. Working on a dummy airfield could be just as dangerous as working on a real one. Aircraft overhead did not discriminate between flesh and framework. To the men there, illusion was not theatre. It was their place of duty. Years later, Werner Thiel would remember one morning differently than all the others. His account described arriving at a decoy training site and seeing not destruction, but insult. Wooden bombs scattered across the artificial field. No fire. No crater. just silent shapes in daylight. Whether his memory is exact or not, his emotion likely is. Because to realize your enemy understands your illusion and decided not even to destroy it would leave a sting far deeper than loss. It meant the joke was on you. Angle 6, Legend and Evidence: How a Story Becomes True. The wooden bomb story sits in a strange battlefield of its own between testimony and proof. No Allied mission logs confirm the drop. No German incident reports archive the discovery. No photographs capture the moment. And yet, it persists. Historians have searched. Archives have been opened. Files have been reviewed. Some accounts place it in Holland. Some in Scotland. Some near Berlin. Some say one bomb. Others say many. Some say they were messages. Others say just plain wood. This inconsistency is the hallmark of legend, but not necessarily of fiction. Often, the most dangerous missions never make it into official logs. Sometimes because they were unauthorized. Sometimes because they were insignificant to command. Sometimes because no one believed them. Veterans throughout history have spoken of things that never entered records, not because they did not happen, but because no one thought they mattered. But stories persist for reasons beyond fact. The wooden bomb story survived because it feels true not in detail, but in spirit. It belongs in a war where entire armies were hidden with sound effects. Where cardboard tanks stopped divisions. Where inflatable armies rewrote maps. In such a world, a wooden bomb does not seem ridiculous. It seems inevitable. It is not a story about destruction. It is a story about understanding. One side realizing the other has pierced the veil. And somewhere in that quiet acknowledgement lies the heart of this strange moment in history. Because once illusion is broken, then something has changed. And what came next would reshape the entire art of war. One night over the wooden airfield. No one knows the exact date. No official log marks the hour. No map confirms the coordinates. But if the wooden bomb incident happened, and the consistency of veteran memory suggests that something close to it did, then it happened quietly. On a night no different from countless others between 1942 and 1944, when airspace over Europe belonged not to nations, but to engines. The sky would have been moon-washed, thick with cloud above and darkness below. An Allied aircraft, alone or in a small formation, would have crossed the coast at altitude, unseen but not unsuspected. Somewhere beneath that aircraft lay a Luftwaffe installation specifically designed to be mistaken for something else. A decoy airfield. Below, dim runway lights glowed softly. Not bright enough to be obvious. Just enough to be convincing. Wooden aircraft waited in neat silence, their shapes freezing shadows into metal forms. Hangars stood in obedience to geometry. The field looked alive, despite being hollow. From the air, it was perfect. In the cockpit, a man peered through frost-laced glass. His eyes searched for confirmation in a motion of doubt. A runway length that matched briefing data. Aircraft silhouettes where they should be. Structures in logical positions. The field did not try too hard to be real. That was its genius. It simply existed. Bomb bay doors opened. But on this night, according to the story, not a single high explosive fell. No buildings vanished. No flames rose. No ground crews died. Instead, something else descended from the dark. Objects fell, turning lazily, their shapes revealed in fleeting moonlight as they spun downward. The impacts were soft, strange, dull thuds rather than fire. And then the aircraft vanished, not in flame, but in silence. Dawn came reluctantly. When German personnel arrived, they did not find ruin. They found mockery. Wooden bombs meticulously crafted lay among wooden aircraft. No detonation. No crater. No heat. just a message carved into form. The bomb had become an artifact. The airfield had become a gallery. The meaning required no translation. This decoy, this clever attempt at misdirection had itself been exposed. The illusion was no longer secret. The men who discovered the bombs would not forget the moment. Not because of destruction, but because of recognition. The enemy had seen through their trick, and had chosen not to destroy it. That choice mattered, because it announced a new phase of the war, not in violence, but in vision. It meant that deception had become a language both sides spoke fluently. It meant that building lies was no longer enough. Now, they had to be believable lies. As the sun rose over grass that would never feel wheels, over shadows that would never move, the wooden airfield stood intact, but naked, its purpose exposed, its future uncertain. Wood had failed as disguise. And from this moment forward, deception would grow teeth. Not by standing still, but by becoming something that could no longer be seen. Decoy versus doctrine, when illusion becomes strategy. If the wooden bomb was ever meant to be anything more than a curiosity, then it was meant to be a signal. Not a boast. Not a threat. A recognition. An acknowledgement of equal cunning. And even if no formal record preserves its fall through the night sky, the idea of it arriving at all fits perfectly within a war that, by 1943, had become as psychological as it was physical. Because by then, the illusion war was no longer improvisation. It was doctrine. Early decoys were crude, designed hastily, built with desperation. But as the conflict deepened, deception matured. It became organized, scheduled, budgeted, and analyzed. British firmament defense evolved into controlled misdirection. Specialized units were formed solely for deception. Engineers, electricians, signal specialists, artists, and physicists. They created scripts using lights, shadows, sound effects, and movement, all designed not to fight the enemy, but to mislead him. Operations such as Britain's Q sites and starfish installations crafted entire shadow cities. Skeletal mock-ups of Coventries and Londres whose purpose was not operation, but attraction. German bombers, lured by false skylines and staged fires, dropped explosives onto fields instead of homes. On the German side, decoy operations expanded as well. Aerial illusions placed near important industrial zones, false rail yards. Entire villages of canvas and cardboard erected to shield factories and depots. The Luftwaffe increasingly paired real installations with mirrored decoys, forcing Allied planners to split attention and bomb loads. Yet the strategic atmosphere had changed. By mid-1943, the Allies no longer flew blind. Signals intelligence revealed German unit movements. Radar coverage expanded. High-altitude reconnaissance bypassed weather and darkness. Photo interpreters had become masters of pattern recognition. They did not simply spot airfields anymore, they studied behavior. They analyzed activity patterns over months. And deception sites grew easier to isolate. As illusion grew more desperate, intelligence grew more precise. Illusion alone could no longer protect reality. And so deception was forced to evolve. It was no longer enough to build something false. One had to perform it. Decoys now moved. Lights shifted nightly. Tracks were recarved daily. Hangar doors changed position. Illusions gained schedules. They behaved. This was the beginning of psychological systems warfare, the art of shaping enemy behavior without direct force. The wooden bomb story, whether literal or symbolic, fits exactly at this cultural junction between amateur deception and professional illusion. And like all turning points, this one did not create destruction. It created embarrassment. Embarrassment is the enemy of illusion. Once a decoy is laughed at, it dies. The moment your enemy stops fearing your setup and begins mocking it, its strategic value collapses. Wooden bombs, if they were ever dropped, would have demolished something without blasting a single brick. They would have destroyed confidence. And in a war built on uncertainty, that was deadly. By the final years of the war, deception had reached its final form. Not static models, but entire imaginary armies. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan that shielded the D-Day landings, fooled Hitler himself into holding forces at Calais long after Allied boots crushed Normandy sand. Inflatable tanks. Fake radio traffic. Phantom divisions commanded by fictional generals. Germany prepared to defend an invasion that never came, while the real one tore into France weeks earlier. That is where the wooden bomb story finally belongs, not in isolation, but within an escalating evolution so large that even armies became illusions. The battlefield no longer ended where guns fell silent. It extended into imagination. And imagination became lethal. By 1945, Europe lay wrecked in stone and smoke. But beneath its ruins was also something invisible. Two sides who had spent years lying to each other and learning to listen. Not to words, but to absence. Not to movement, but to unnatural silence. And once war learns how to lie, it never forgets. What remained were the consequences. Bombs, myths, and the cost of deception. When the engines finally went silent in Europe in May of 1945, the war left behind more than ruins and graves. It left behind questions. And among them lingered a strange one. How many bombs, dropped at enormous cost in fuel, lives and machines, had fallen on nothing at all? The answer, historians now know, is more than most people imagine. Decoy airfields, dummy towns, and fake installations absorbed a measurable share of enemy fire. In Britain alone, hundreds of decoy sites were constructed during the war, many of them activated only during raids, when fires would be lit and lights switched on at the precise moment bombers appeared overhead. Night after night, Luftwaffe crews were drawn away from real cities by theatrical flames dancing in the dark. Real bombs fell. Real explosions happened. But in empty places. Fields cratered instead of factories. Barns burned instead of neighborhoods. These false sights did not make war bloodless, but they bent its trajectory. And when trajectories bend, survivors are created. German decoys worked in the same way, though increasingly less effectively as Allied reconnaissance improved. Fake airstrips in France, the Netherlands, and Italy received Allied bombloads long after photographers had identified their sham nature. Sometimes the deception worked. Sometimes planners knew it was fake and bombed it anyway. Because destroying illusion was still a message. Post-war analysis revealed that entire missions had been devoted to targets that never existed or never functioned. Aircraft were lost subduing illusions. Crews were killed trying to silence ghosts. Money poured into steel and explosives that meant nothing but wood. And yet, that paradox is the point. In war, waste becomes strategy. Resources are consumed not just by necessity, but by design. If a decoy convinced the enemy to deploy aircraft, anti-aircraft units, radar coverage, and fuel in response, then it had already succeeded. Victory could be manufactured not only by destruction, but by distraction. The wooden bomb story lives at the center of this paradox. Because whether the bombs existed or not, the environment that would produce such an act absolutely did. A war where plywood tanks fooled generals. A war where sound crews simulated divisions with speakers and switches. A war where entire cities survived because their doubles burned elsewhere. Illusions saved lives. But it also stole truth. The deeper deception ran, the harder it became even after peace to tell which shadows had been real. And as veterans returned home, stories returned with them. Some were precise. Some were psychological. And some, like the wooden bombs, balanced on the edge between both. But if these stories mattered enough to persist, then they served a purpose beyond fact. They expressed something real: frustration, defiance, mockery, the desire after years of obedience to remember at least one moment when war looked foolish. To remember a time when humanity outwitted machinery, not with armor, but with insight. And yet beneath amusement sat reckoning. Because deception did not come free. Men died servicing fake targets. Men were killed bombing empty spaces. And in the night skies over Europe, the lie consumed pilots just as easily as reality. The war did not care if a man fell over a city or a field. The ground was equally final. And once the illusions were dismantled, burned, buried, or left to rot, a quieter casualty remained: certainty, which war never returns. From war story to urban legend, wars end on paper long before they end in memory. When Europe began to rebuild after 1945, fields were ploughed where runways never truly existed. Wooden aircraft were burned for scrap. Camouflage netting rotted into soil. The great illusions of the air war disappeared almost overnight, leaving no monuments, no plaques, no preserved ruins. But the stories stayed. Veterans carried them home like shrapnel beneath the skin. Some told them in pubs. Others in letters. A few wrote them down. And over the decades, these fragments bled into books, newspaper columns, and eventually into classrooms and websites, where facts and folklore began to overlap like old photographs. The wooden bomb story traveled this route exactly. In one retelling, the airfield stood somewhere in Holland. In another, it lay outside Berlin. Some claimed it was years before the war ended. Others insisted it was earlier, before the Allies had fully mastered reconnaissance. Time and place shifted like smoke. Did British pilots drop the bombs? Did the Americans? Was there one? Or many? Each version carried conviction. None carried proof. This did not disqualify the story, but it placed it into a category every historian knows well. Anecdote. Not false. Not certain. Suspended. Over the years, writers tried to pin it down. Researchers traced the name Werner Thiel through Luftwaffe rosters. They examined training school records around Borcade. They scanned Allied raid logs for anomalous entries, payloads too light, missions with strange footnotes. Nothing conclusive appeared. But war is not a clean archive. It is fragmentation. Crates burned. Files lost. Orders spoken but never written. Acts taken without authorization. If wooden bombs were dropped, they might have happened as a whim. A morale trick. A single pilot's private rebellion against a war that had grown too large. And such rebellion rarely comes with paperwork. And yet, the story refuses to vanish. Not because it is funny, but because it makes sense. It belongs in the same reality as inflatable tanks that fooled generals and fake radio stations that moved armies, and cities spared because their replicas burned. The wooden bomb is plausible because everything around it is real. What it offers is not just shock. It offers release. A reminder that not all warfare came from steel-handed bureaucrats. Some of it came from men in cockpits who still possessed humor, humanity, defiance. And whether the bomb fell from an aircraft or from memory, its impact is undeniable. The story sticks because it reshapes something unbearable into something wry. It allows us to picture destruction without death. War as irony. War as intellect. War as a game of shadows where, just once, no one died to prove a point. And maybe that is why the story became immortal. Because among all the massacres and marches and manifestos, the idea of a wooden bomb feels like mercy. It feels like a pause. Like a man looking down from the sky and deciding that tonight, fire was not necessary. Which leads us not into triumph, but into reflection. Wood, steel, and the things we choose to remember. Long after the last flames died out, the wooden airfields were forgotten by the earth. Grass swallowed their false runways. Rain erased the outlines of imitation hangars. And the aircraft that never flew vanished into soil like the bones of something that had never lived. What remained was not timber. What remained was meaning. The story of wooden bombs endures not because it is proven, but because it feels possible in a war that made the impossible routine. A war where cities pretended, and armies existed only on maps that lied. A war that taught the world something uncomfortable. That belief could be as deadly as gunfire. And that illusion could be as powerful as truth. Whether a pilot once dropped carved wood instead of steel matters less, in the end, than what the story tells us about those who fought. That even in the most industrial massacre in human history, men still searched for ways to outthink rather than destroy. To humiliate rather than annihilate. To answer lies with intelligence instead of death. In a century defined by machines, perhaps the most human weapon of all was not a bomb. It was understanding. We will never know exactly where the wooden airfield stood, or if it stood at all. But we do know this. Somewhere in that war between flak bursts and firestorms there lived a moment where destruction could have happened and did not. A moment where the enemy was not killed, only seen. And in that seeing, history took a breath. The war moved on. It always does. But this story didn't move with it. It stayed. In memory. In possibility. In the quiet suggestion that in the greatest violence the world has ever built, someone once chose not to break it.